People of Reddit that work in an insane asylum, what is the craziest story you have? My mom worked in a mental hospital during the big 2011 blackout in Cali. When the power went out in the mental hospital, the backup generators didn't kick in. The result was every single patient door opening, letting every single patient free. My mom said she locked herself in her office and the only light was a red emergency light, which made everything sinister. She said all she could hear was the patients screaming until security finally got things under control. Pretty creepy stuff. My first day on the job, I met a 400-pound woman who gave me the most innocent childlike smile I have ever seen. She then proceeded to scratch between her behemoth bosoms and produced a chicken leg. She finished that into bites, and while I'm stammering to ask what I just saw, she reaches between her legs and pulls out a chicken wing from her hoochie snapper and ate it. I found out from staff the last time they had chicken was a week ago. Later in the day, I heard moaning that sounded like a cat dying. I went to investigate and found a patient with their fist inserted into their rectum. They then proceeded to pull it out and flung a turd across the room like a monkey. I later learned that she could anally fist herself with either arm. Welcome to your first day on the job. This thread can't reasonably get any honest responses due to the stringency of confidentiality laws. Even if you don't disclose names and places, it's still frowned upon to discuss such things, and honestly it's unprofessional. I've spent 4 cumulative years in psychiatric wards and treatment centers as a patient for depression, defiance issues, etc. and I could tell a lot of stories, but ultimately the most important thing to remember is that these are real people with real health issues, and their behavior, while perhaps disturbing, isn't for your entertainment. So while I'm not going to pass any judgment on the posters of this thread, I really do urge you all to consider the seriousness of mental illness and the legitimacy of worth a human life has, even if it's a bit damaged. I worked at a hospital, an inpatient psychiatric hospital. There was this boy, I think he was about 15. He originally came to our hospital in the winter time. He had been aggressive and really depressed, but other than that, he was your average teen. A couple months later, he was rehospitalized. This time, he had a completely different presentation. His affect was all wrong. He was cold, distant, and he hardly remembered me. One night, after I had gone home, he went to use the bathroom. After being in there for like 20 minutes, the staff went looking for him. With some verbal prodding, he reluctantly opened the door to the bathroom. There he stood, completely nude, save for the fesses, which painted him from head to toe. Oh, and the 2 payday-sized turds he ferociously gripped in each hand. He then gestured all Matrix style to the staff, with a sort of Neo/Morpheus come hither gesture. The staff donned the hazard suits, and then bull charged him. He had smeared poop all over the walls, and in the light switch. They sedated and restrained him that night. When I came in the next day, the nurses told me what had happened. I went to go check in on him, since I'd had previously established a relationship and real rapport with him. He proceeded to ask me if I had ever been raped, had sex with a man, or seen God. Yeah. That was when I really understood the power of psychosis. And I now have more empathy, understanding, and respect for all of my majorly mentally ill clients. Many decades ago, my mother's friend had a severely incapacitated adult child in a mental home. He always complained that the orderlies were out to get him, but his parents dismissed his complaints because, well, he was crazy. Turns out the son died, and the autopsy found dirt in his lungs. An investigation followed, and he was killed when an orderly restrained him by pushing his face into a potted plant, and he sucked dirt into his lungs as he was suffocating. His father wrote a letter to a local paper in which he libeled the shit out of the mental home. They sued him, he lost everything, and he committed suicide within days of the verdict. His wife died years later alone. I don't work at a psychiatric hospital anymore, but I used to work at a large state hospital. A guy on another unit pried his eye partially out with a plastic spork. I did not witness this, but it happened while I worked there. This one guy would pry his turds out with a pen and stack them in geometric sculptures in his room. He also filled his drawer with pee. I once helped this woman get cleaned up in the shower. She came in all covered in shit and piss and vomit. She was there for a few weeks, so I got to know her a little. Then, I myself had a nervous breakdown a few months later and had to be hospitalized. Different hospital. She was in there too, and remembered me, and helped me get used to being on the inside. Was weird. Not me, but my dad. He worked in one for about a year, and one of the patients there always threatened to kill my dad if he saw him on the other side. Many years later my dad ran into the man at Disneyland. Luckily the man was on longer insane and did not try to murder my dad, but instead thanked my dad for helping him. I have 100 stories. Once, a 60-ish-year-old woman whispered to my coworker, "I need to show you something." She walked in the bathroom, came back and handed my friend a bracelet while saying I hid it in my vagina. I've seen lots of shit thrown and smeared. That's mostly with dementia patients or people detoxing from alcohol. By the way, it's very hard to get shit out from under fingernails. And the sex. You would be very surprised how fast people can have sex. I've been there when 2 patients had sex on a washer in less than 2 minutes. They didn't even know each other's names. I'm pretty sure no one came. Not mine, but my mother worked in a mental hospital as a nurse shortly after receiving her degree. One of the patients to which she attended was a large black man. She asked him one day how he was doing, and he responded, "Sometimes voices tell me to kill white women." To which she responded, "Are they talking to you now?" I did medical clearances for a psychot at a county in Sonoma County circa. I worked there for a year and a half. One time we had a guy who went on a meth bender for days on end and did nothing but play World of Warcraft during this days long bender. He was also schizophrenic or something. I can't remember what the nurse said. Anyway, he was living in the video game, screaming about Azeroth ECT. Thought the nurses were bad guys. We had to restrain him. Another good one was a woman who came into the ER to say she was suicidal. She saw the line and went back out to her car and committed suicide by taking a bunch of pills. A few days later her sister turned up looking for her. I found her dead in the back of her car. No one had noticed. After a long time in places like this, you do become desensitized. Sorry if I sound callous. Over 4 summers, I worked with 6 to 10 residents of a nearby rural psychiatric hospital. They came every day for work therapy to a small, isolated government poultry lab/farm where I earned my tuition between semesters. The patients were all reasonably functioning individuals, though some were slow moving and slow thinking. It was the early 70s, a much less litigious time, so although my fellow poultry technicians and I had no training in handling people with issues like this, we were expected, as part of our regular duties, to supervise them while they worked. Their work therapy consisted of helping us with simple, routine tasks like sweeping up, distributing feed, gathering and counting eggs, removing dead birds, and of course, shoveling lots and lots of chicken shit. Most of them had been working there for years, and had the rest of us ever simultaneously booked a sick day, could undoubtedly have carried on perfectly well on their own. So I never considered any of them a physical threat. The biggest dangers they ever presented were trying to sneak a verboten smoke in the poultry barns, and a marked tendency to goof off the moment they thought nobody was watching. Some of the test birds were kept in large screened pens, containing up to 1,000 fowl each. One day late in my 4th and last summer there, Bob, one of our slowest movers, was in just such a pen gathering eggs, when he suddenly, and without warning, had what a layman like myself would call a severe panic attack, perhaps even a full-out psychotic episode. Now, Bob was a very big guy, about 6 feet 6 inches and maybe 300 pounds, an ex-Mountie who had been brain damaged when he had tried to break up a bar fight solo, and was cold-cocked with a whiskey bottle. Me, I was just 5 feet 8 inches, a third-string wrestler in the varsity squad's 137-pound class, who never had to worry much about making weight. Although I was in very good shape, average build would have been kind. I was in another pen, 3 over and around a corner, when Bob had his episode. When I heard the ruckus, it took me a few seconds to extract myself from the cage without squashing anything, button it up, dash down the corridor, locate the disturbance, and enter the pen, where normally passive, terrified of mice, quiet old genial giant Bob was now screaming at the top of his lungs and flailing around mightily, as if battling biblical demons. In response, the 3,000 birds housed in that cage and its two neighbors were simultaneously sounding their ape alarms and striving mightily to recapture their ancestral capacity for flight. The resulting chaos, cacophony, and dust cloud made it hard to see, hear, and evaluate, but it was unmistakable that there was blood and broken eggs everywhere. In just the few seconds it had taken me to arrive, Bob had already pulled the heads off nearly 24 hens, and was clearly going for the record, whatever it was. Around my feet, their headless corpses energetically danced, jumped, and spurted gore. Yes, they really do that. Not knowing what else to do, I took a wild and foolish chance. I put a hand on his forearm, which was as big around as my calf, and said, Bob, you're hurting them." To my astonishment he stopped immediately, put his arms down by his sides, and hung his head. A few moments later, when I suggested that maybe we should go get a coffee, he allowed me to lead him gently by the shoulder away from the mass of still panicking birds, out of the barn, across the yard, and into the coffee room, the human space closest to the scene of slaughter. The other patients just picked up their brooms and carried on, as if nothing had happened. I imagine they were seeking comfort in their routines, and I cannot blame them. Bob didn't attempt to explain, or apologize, or even to speak. He just hung his head and stared at the linoleum. The farm supervisor was out on an errand, so I had to open up the office and call the hospital myself. Being just a seasonal drone, and therefore an unfamiliar name to them, I had a bit of trouble making them understand what had just happened. There was some initial disbelief that Bob was capable of such behavior, but two equally large ward attendants came to pick up Bob perhaps 15 minutes later, in a very Ghostbusters looking 60s hearse thing. They brought along medical restraints, but didn't use them. Poor old Bob just sat quietly until the attendants led him to their Ictamobile and took him away to God knows what. Bob never came back. I returned to school 3 weeks later, and I never saw him or the research station again. It was shut down a few years later. But I've often wondered, supping a scotch in the wee, quiet thoughtful hours, about exactly what malevolent vision had set Bob off, and about how those few, brief seconds of unclarity had affected the rest of his life, and any opportunity he might otherwise have had for rehabilitation and release. Stories from a friend, a doctor, not an insane asylum worker. Gender and some details may or may not have been changed for patient confidentiality. A woman was admitted to the hospital at 2 AM after calling police and telling them that she had overdosed on some medications. Upon first examination, she was fine, but she wouldn't tell physicians or nurses at the hospital what she had taken, and they were concerned there might have been some acetaminophen, which can cause liver failure, so they wanted to hold her until they could perform some test. Apparently this woman was a frequent flyer, probably homeless, a history of self-harm behavior. This particular instance, someone missed the self-harming part, and this patient was left alone and unrestrained at some point for 5 to 10 minutes. In that time she managed to swallow several razor blades and needles, all sterile, luckily, a fact which she gladly informed hospital staff of a few hours later. QGI surgery, the service my friend was on, and a whole heck of mess. Notably during the surgery, one of the surgical nurses who was palpating the small intestine for any missed blockage/debris after the surgery, but before closing, ended up cutting her hand through the patient's small intestine when she closed her hand on an unaccounted for razor blade. Not a pleasant experience for anyone. Patient survived and was fine, but apparently wasn't even committed, just placed on a hold. Public funding for mental health is really low, so there isn't really a place for people like this if they are destitute/homeless and are generally lucid, but with some problematic behaviors. Not quite what you asked, but semi-related. I work in an adult day healthcare program, and we have a lot of registrants with severe mental illness that come to us for the day, and we monitor and help them stay living in the community. One morning, about a year into working there, it was about 8 AM and I realized I was alone in a room with about 7 registrants with schizophrenia. I remember thinking how different each of them were affected by this illness. One gentleman, Richard, came in. He was almost 70 and had a small cut above his eye. I asked him what happened and he sighed and said, "Well, I'll tell ya, about 4 o'clock this morning, I got in a fight with a kangaroo. I was too dumbfounded to speak, but that instant another individual with delusional disorder and weighs about 450 pounds wheels up to Richard and says, "Richard, that's ridiculous. Stop telling stories. You did not get in a fight with a kangaroo." I thought to myself, wow, that was bold, but good job trying to keep him from telling tall tales. No sooner did I finish thinking that, she finishes her sentence. "You did not get in a fight with a kangaroo. Because I've been in a fight with a kangaroo and you get beat up worse than a cut on your eye." "What color was the kangaroo that hit you?" He said, "I don't know. I didn't get a good look at him." Long story short, schizophrenic patient comes in with a cut on his eye and says he got into a fight with a kangaroo in the middle of the night. Delusional patient corrects him, and just when I think she's providing a dose of sanity, she tries to top his story with something even more incredible. My best friend's grandma used to be an orderly. She told me the following story. Patient is sent to the mental hospital for murdering someone, but he was criminally insane. Fast forward a year, she knows him pretty well, and he is a generally nice person. A few months later his mom and dad come to visit crazy guy. They bring stuff for a picnic. Bread, meat, cheese, knife, spoons, forks, chips, and other goodies. They are eating for a while in the grass area in front of the hospital, not much attention being paid to them. Orderlies see one of the parents lying on the floor, the other one with the murderer on top of them. He puts the knife down and sits back down. The parents had both their throats slit. She never found out what happened to him. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I will try to see if I can find an article. TL. Doctor, murderer sent to asylum, murders mom and dad when they visit. My ex-BF and I spent our fair share of time at our own respective psychiatric wards. My ex met this boy who completely and utterly believed that he was invisible. If you looked at him, he would look back really weird at you and run away. He spent most of his days standing in the hallway staring at people.